Oh, okay. I think we're live now. We are live. Just like that little thing. So welcome to Scales of Bioprocessing from Self-Care to Healthcare. I'd like to say that Sharona Franklin couldn't make it to the panel today, but Ramy Kim and Sean Hercules are here, and they're both amazing, amazing practitioners in their own disciplines. But before we start, I want to recognize that although we are calling in from different areas. We are settlers in traditional territories where indigenous communities have called these lands home before the arrival of settlers. And I'd like to thank Sugar Contemporary for holding this discussion through their platform. They are a curatorial research-based art gallery in Toronto run by phenomenal curators, and their ongoing programming this year focuses on fermentation. Sister Co-Resistor is a feminist arts collective focused on collaborative art making and transdisciplinary exchange, crisscrossing social practice with intersectional feminism and contemporary arts as a radical act of solidarity building. I've been a part of this amorphous collective since its conception, and I'm happy to take on the lead in this project in exploring the topic of bioprocessing with such amazing panelists and collaborators. So I'm just going to give like a brief introduction. I'm not a scientist. I'm an artist, and I really enjoy artifact making in between the realms of arts and science, because I find it's a great way to get the general public to engage with concepts they might not have engaged with before. And it brings like a different culture and perspectives to science that makes it more welcoming. So bioprocessing is the process of raising organisms for certain compounds or ingredients. I'd say that one of the most basic examples of this is like beer or yogurt. For beer, you provide yeast with sugar, and the yeast produces ethanol. And in an environment that's difficult for pathogens to populate in. For yogurt, bacteria or lactobacillus will consume lactose, and then it will produce lactic acid. And I consider this at like its very basic level, bioprocessing. And I would like to recognize this as a technology. And it has existed for thousands of years, even though it was done through spontaneous fermentation, chance, and inherited knowledge. And I'm not referring to genetic memory. I'm like referring to, transfer of knowledge through culture. Over thousands of years that we've collaborated with microorganisms for food and medicine, I would like to also add that we've domesticated various strains of yeast and bacteria, not only to support our industrial food complex, but to serve as soft machines for producing medicine. A simple explanation would be, imagine if you manipulated the metabolism of yeast, that instead of feeding it sugar to produce ethanol, like you would bring beer, you would edit this process instead to produce pharmaceuticals, flavors, and various other compounds. I think it's incredible when we think of self-care and healthcare, that we think of these operations on a very human scale. But I think it's forgotten by a lot of people who are not invested in exploring this process further, that a lot of these life-giving processes are done in collaboration with microorganisms. So I'm bringing these panelists here today because I'm fascinated with how you all interface with science, the biomedical industry, and your visions for self-care and healthcare. So give me a little bit about yourself.
Do you want to go first, Ramy?
No, please go ahead, Sean.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Sean Hercules, and I am originally from the beautiful sunny island of Barbados, which I wish it was there right now because it's pretty sunny there and not cold like I am right now in Canada. But I am currently doing my PhD in biology at McMaster University. And before I came here for my PhD, I did a Master of Public Health. And after my Master of Public Health, I was very interested in non-communicable diseases, which are largely preventable, but they have a huge toll on the healthcare system, especially in small island developing states such as Barbados. So I was very interested in in researching that area and reducing the prevalence of NCDs in the Caribbean region. And then I started my PhD, where I am now investigating aggressive breast cancers. specifically in women of African ancestry. So that just means that I have patients from Nigeria and Barbados and Jamaica in my study currently. And I am just investigating why breast cancer is more aggressive within these populations compared to other populations. Because the incidence is higher in other populations. However, the mortality is much higher within women of African ancestry. So I'm just trying to understand why that is in the lab at McMaster University. I don't know what else to add. Yeah.
Well, I guess I can go then. Hi, everyone. I'm Ramy. This is greetings from Oakland, California. We have flowers right now outside, and I thought I'd bring them inside since we are sheltering in place currently. I guess I can be best described as environmental health scientist activist. I do community organizing and I do some education. I've been trained in public health, but the way my practice works now is that I help run a community bio lab in Oakland, California called Counterculture Labs. I also work on a project to try to make open source insulin on the local level called Open Insulin. And when I do my own work in public health and around environmental health, I think about community engagement, how to actually decentralize knowledge that's purposely sometimes kept away from people who are experiencing it. So a lot of my work, my personal work, has focused on environmental justice issues. How do you actually make data, environmental data, readable, legible, and usable, so that people actually have the autonomy and agency to use those data, which for me is super important, because if you're having a disconnect between your own place and the information around it, you are disconnected. And so citizen science, which through the lab at Counterculture, we practice citizen science, being anyone can do biology or science. This all marries the things that I do in my own practice, because we are investigating the world around us, whether it's the built environment or the natural environment. We're also learning how to biohack or hack biology. And as Ananda said before, how do we take a yeast, for example, and create something like insulin, something that's life-saving, that we take for granted if we don't have diabetes. But if we are insulin dependent, it is like the air that everyone breathes. So, and lastly, my next interest is producing some sort of bioart in terms of thinking critically about environmental justice issues. And this has been a new foray for me, and I'm quite excited about it. And so I can talk more about that later.
Awesome. So everyone on the panel is here because they want to see change in their healthcare systems. And I think it's amazing that you all come from various disciplines and you have such rigor in your curiosities. I feel like you all bring such amazing perspectives, but I feel like the public perception of science doesn't see these diversities and perspectives. Why does this happen? And like, how do you fight against it? How do you find support for your discipline?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I can bring up like anecdotally something that was like, I've been working with high schoolers in Deep East Oakland, which is geographically very far from me. It's a 20-minute drive. So I live in a dense urban area, so 20-minute drive seems very far for me. But with that in mind, I wanted to explore DIY bio, or do-it-yourself biology and biotech and open science with younger children in high school. But I had to actively recruit among high schoolers to join my program. And so what I did was go into the classes, and I was a complete stranger, and I would just ask them like, hey, why don't you like science? Or do you like science? No, why? It's hard. Those would be the responses. And so that to me was a baseline, and obviously a very late baseline because we're looking at high schoolers, or I was looking at high schoolers, but it was a late baseline and a gut check to say, this is what the kids actually are saying. And so this is just persisting into the future, whether going on to university or, just going about daily life. And if that's perception, perhaps if we can intervene earlier in high school to start thinking about what sharing biotechnological methods look like in an open or DIY way, so that they're able to do experiments at home and make it theirs, teach mom, teach grandma, teach their little brother. I felt that the ownership was really important. And so it's just I'm sure there are a lot of actually educationally based theory and work out there, but I'm not a professional educator, so I didn't rely on that, but I did rely on talking to other educators in the field and my gut instinct. So that's sort of like what I'm working towards, kind of having them be people who feel that they can own science.
Oh, I love that. When I first moved to Canada, I was very involved in this group. It's a national organization, a volunteer organization called Let's Talk Science. And essentially, this organization allows students from various universities to go into various schools in their communities and do fun science experiments with them and explain the science behind it. So I got involved in my first year here, and I would probably sign up for 2 events every week, which is a lot when you're doing grad school. But I was just very excited about Let's Talk Science. I love to interact with the children, and I love to see when they just realize this cool science fact while they're doing the whatever experiment they're doing. I just really love that. And then we started also volunteering within the hospital. So our campus is connected to a hospital. It's a hospital for children specifically. So then we started also doing volunteering there as another form of outreach. And I just really enjoyed that form of outreach. So it's really interesting that you also do outreach within high schools and stuff, because that was really where my science communication really started. And then from then, I started sharing what I was doing with these high schoolers on my Instagram, and not high schoolers, but children in general. I started doing that on Instagram, and then I realized there are other people on the internet talking about science with other people on Instagram. What? So that was really cool, and through that, I I met Sam, so Science Sam on Instagram, a really great friend of mine, and we met in person. We met last year, and her and another PhD student at U of T, Geek, along with the support from RCI Science, which is a science group in Canada. Um, we started this event called Science is a Drag. So essentially, um, we had performers in drag, scientists, and we did lip syncs and to various songs, and then we talked about science in drag, and it was a packed audience. Um, it was free, but we had people sign up and RSVP. And for the first one in July, tickets were sold out within 24 hours. Um, and then we just had the second one last week, Monday, and they were sold out under 30 minutes. And that just goes to show that people really want to see a different type of image to what is typically seen of just old white men in lab coats as like the face of science. And it was a really great way to communicate science to a group of people who probably would have never like cared about listening really to science. So yeah, that's another way to answer your question, Amanda, in how I've been involved with this partnership with my friends and RCI Science to create a space for other identities in science.
I haven't been to Science is a Drag, but I really want to, but I've never seen anything like it. And as soon as I saw it, I was so excited because I hadn't seen science communication with that kind of cultural mix in in Toronto in like a really long time. It was like really exciting.
Yeah, it was really fun.
I can't wait to come visit.
So we're expanding soon, so we might come to your city.
Yay, do it.
Yeah.
So the next question is like kind of super general, but do you think there's a difference between healthcare and medicine?
So my first instinct when I think of medicine, I think of like actual medicine, whether that's pills from big pharma or whether it's through nutrients and minerals that you get from your vegetables and your fruit. Like things you are consuming, to me, is my definition of medicine. And healthcare to me is more broader. It's not just the actual pill or the like what you're consuming, but it's how that's administered. It's the team that's working towards improving your overall health. Yeah, it's everything around the actual channel or medium of medicine. Yeah, that's my first instinct at least.
Okay.
Yeah, I tend to think about medicine as something that could be considered less formal or formal, so spanning a lot more spatially, temporally. So like we can think about indigenous medicines or traditional Chinese medicines from like 3,000 years ago, or things that humans have relied on as being something palliative, herbs, things like that. And I think of that as medicine. And then there's the practice of medicine, of course. But that, I guess, in the contemporary sense, when I think about healthcare, I think about systems and institutions that may or may not work with the medicine. So it could be actually antagonistic towards medicine. It could be a dominant idea of what health should be. And that affects care. We know that directly. We know that on the ground. We know that from studies. So, sometimes I do feel that healthcare as a system could be at odds with medicine as healing. So that's sort of like my gut reaction and my feelings around that. And so I do get very, very skeptical when I'm thinking about healthcare as a system, or I become more critical to make sure like who they're serving is for the patient or the individual's best interest and not necessarily the institution's best interest.
Mm-hmm. We're going to kind of segue a little bit and kind of, I really want to also talk about the topic of self-care because I feel like in people's realms and idea of care in the last couple of years, people have been really drawn to the idea of creating rituals for themselves as an extension of sort of like accessing healthcare. And so I know that in the past couple of years, self-care has been co-opted by neoliberalism in this image of like candles and kombucha and clean eating. But I really want to hear from people that are involved in public health, like what is the definition of self-care that you have? You don't have to answer it. And if this question isn't clear, that's okay too. I'm just like curious. Okay. So
I can start off if Sean's still thinking. I'm, floating my flowers around. This question is particularly poignant as we're indoors and limiting physical and social contact. And I can start off by saying, for me, self-care is actually surrounding myself with things that I really enjoy visually to have around me, and that could be flowers. Here's a mushroom that I picked the other week. So just getting out and hiking, to me, whether it's solo or now with social distancing, a friend, catching up. Self-care is definitely going to evolve in this current state and in this current climate for sure. But I'm absolutely with you in terms of being having been co-opted by, again, an industry, a system, an institution, mainly around capitalism, right? I'm looking at you, Gwyneth Paltrow. But self-care as, again, a baseline, what to me feels like do what makes you feel good and not what the magazines tell you. And if it means eating a good meal, if it means sometimes my favorite food is fried chicken. So my partner knows if I have a bad day, he brings me fried chicken. So it's pretty obvious to him, how the self-care, he can help me in my self-care. And it doesn't have to be necessarily clean eating. And one thing that I would want to caution against is sort of like the classist, racist, and sort of like undertones of what that means and the shaming that is sort of, it's not actually something that I want to see happen in the industry of self-care, but for whatever reason, people actually do that shaming. And I do think it's very sad. And so what we can do as educators and activists is to actually think about how do we counteract that narrative and make sure that shaming doesn't happen.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. For me, self-care, it shouldn't be this one big blanket term. It's so individual. And I think that's what has a lot of millennials, really us, really. Like we are consuming everything on the internet that we see. And it seems as though, oh, well, self-care is only if you do this, or as you said, like drink kombucha, or or like all these weird things that these influencers are throwing at us to consume. Um, like you said, fried chicken for me on a Tuesday because it's like $3.97 on a Tuesday. So that's what I do on a Tuesday specifically for my self-care. And that's not kombucha at all or clean eating. Like that should just be disbanded. I hate to see that on my timeline. If it does come up, I block or I send a message saying this is ignorant, stop this. Yeah, self-care for me, like I am going to bake a banana bread later tonight because baking for me is like a zen moment. It's science, but at home, like for me, it's like you have to have 1 cup of this. Like it's very precise, and I like using that part of my brain to enjoy afterwards. Yeah, that's what self-care is for me. And it's also I am so like I love to be around humans, so this time of not of social distancing is very interesting for me. Um, but usually another form of self-care for me would just be stop doing what I'm doing and go talk with my friends, have a drink, eat some food. It doesn't even have to be around eating, like just spending time, quality time with people that are close to me and just talking about life. That is self care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So great. Before we move on to the next question, I'm just going to read out some comments. Dr. May 18 says, "What city does science drag happen in?"
So currently, Science is a Drag has only happened in Toronto so far, but we are expanding soon. And follow us on Instagram, Science is a Drag, and you'll see a lot more information there. If you want us to come to your city, you can drop the comment under the photo about us expanding. It's there. It's there.
Is a Science as a Drag is the handle?
Science is a Drag.
Science as a Drag. Science is a Drag. Science.
Yeah.
I'm adding you now.
There is it's not a question, but more of a comment from H. Galtiano, who says DIY bio seems like it could rebuild connection between healthcare and indigenous and traditional medicine as the separation grew from the imposed hierarchical med complex.
Yeah.
And then goes into more specific detail, med, Proto-Indo-European root, meaning take appropriate measures. So that's like another comment.
Yeah.
The next question is, what is your relationship to GMOs? Can we see them as being healing? Could you see them being contextualized in the same romantic images as the current commercialized productions of self-care? Is that weird?
I mean, I feel like I know where this is coming from, but Sean,
Yeah.
jump in.
You can go. You can go.
Sure. I think when I was younger, to be honest, and this falls in line, I've learned from my mistakes in terms of being clean, being organic, and stuff like that. So when that was popularized, and when I was young and not understanding of all of the dynamics, whether it's food justice or there was a lot more systemic stuff that I had to investigate. And at that point, I was like, no GMOs, heritage lines only, or that kind of thing. And I also realized that smacked of bigotry. And when at the same time, I understand where that comes from. That being said, what that meant for me, or what that means for me in my present day and my practice, is that I am all for GMOs. I am all for affordable foods. I'm all for things that require extra engineering so that we can get something like foods to other people. And then, on the other side that I touched upon before is GMO medicines, right? We are modifying these organisms such as yeast to produce things that we want. For another example, aside from the Open Insulin Project, is the Real Vegan Cheese Project, based in my lab as well. And they are taking yeast and producing a protein or a series of proteins called casein that we find in animal-based milk, but it's called real vegan cheese, right? And so, your animal is not producing it, but it's supposed to be a couple of proteins that are identical found in animal products. And so in that respect, I am all for it. However, on the other flip side is what I am very vigilant for is the weaponization of GMOs. And, again, industries, big companies weaponizing it, making it so that access is limited in some way for their own benefit. And so, that's the other side of the coin.
Yeah, you answered that really well, actually. I don't have much to add to what you said because you said a lot of the things I would have said. But
I'm going to keep my mouth shut.
No, don't. But my first real, I should say relationship, but one of the first times that I was confronted, that's the word, confronted with this whole GMO thing was actually when it was shortly after I moved here. There was another grad student at the time, and there was some party happening, and there were snacks all over. and they had like the non-GMO sign, and he just took out a marker out of nowhere and just X'd it off of all of the stats. He's like, this doesn't make sense. Nothing is non-GMO. And I was like, what is he talking about? And then really from then, like that sparked curiosity about what is he really saying? And like what? Because I really didn't think about these things before leaving Barbados, to be honest. And yeah, when I saw that, I started to do some investigation myself, and I said, wow, this is a lot that people are really benefiting these big corporations off of this brand of non-GMO. And yeah, I just stopped really from since then. I stopped, or I made a more conscious effort to not buy non-GMO food because it's usually more expensive to buy. It's not affordable. It's yeah, it's dumb.
So before we move on, there's a question in the comments from Xenia. Hi, I'm wondering if it's possible to reflect on the relationship between healthcare and labor, if there's an opportunity to rethink our relationship that goes through this health crisis.
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Hi, I'm wondering if it's possible to reflect on the relationship between healthcare and labor, or if there's an opportunity to rethink our relationship to that labor through this health crisis. So kind of like the relationship and perception of like public health from the general public. Do you think it will change after this crisis, or what do you hope? I don't know.
I feel like since the situation that we're in right now, I've been seeing a lot more attention on social media from people applauding healthcare workers. They deserve to be applauded 100% because they're working a lot longer hours now. They're putting themselves in a position where they're not able to spend time with their families because they're being exposed and they don't want to expose their family. So yeah, it's a lot, but it made me wonder, like, well, people weren't really as this supportive of the healthcare industry before, or it seemed that way to me. So yeah, I actually thought about that this morning when I saw, I can't remember what city it was, but people were just clapping in the streets for the doctors and nurses, the cleaning staff, like all the healthcare workers throughout this time. And yeah, it really made me think about that. So I've also been asking myself that question. Like, do we have an opportunity here to really think about this more? Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely have thoughts on that as well. Big surprise. The thing that I think about from the point of healthcare and labor is who is expendable, and you know, this idea of triage, because we're in this crisis mode. The idea of triage and who gets to live and who gets to die come into play. I've also been thinking about sort of the ties of the healthcare industry with politics and money, and also volunteers who have been doing sort of very parallel work in, let's say, finding an answer for an open source vaccine or screening, rapid screening for it, and how in America that access to testing has been stymied or stemmed for whatever. I mean, I have personal theories as to why those tests are not readily available to us. But part of it is, I think, is sort of a control and handshakes between government and business. And so again, because where my brain is normally at when I think about systems, is that I do think about like how the labor down here they're not necessarily representative of what's going on in sort of like the bigger umbrella. of healthcare. And so I worry that our frontline healthcare workers are being seen as either expendable or because of our lack of preparation. And when I say our, I'm blaming the whole country or valuation of our healthcare workers prior to this crisis, that we are shortchanging them and their families. So yeah, I kind of think it sounds gloomy, but it's towards a better future in thinking about the value of their labor, the people on the ground, and how we can support that by doing more work and holding the institutions accountable for putting them in these conditions without protection or, without assurances. So.
So that kind of leads into the next question. Because the power is held in those few big pharma companies, what would decentralization look like? How would these supply chains operate? Sometimes I think about the history of communist bioscience. It still kind of exists today. And like, I'm just interested in thinking about like alternative methods of knowledge production. What new systems or what do you think we need? Sorry if some of that didn't make sense, but you could like answer that however you want. Okay, what would these supply chains look like?
Ananda, I think I've thought about all this. Well, I think basically, and hopefully it is something that is relevant to Sean's work too. When we think about new models, I think we should be looking to models that are already in existence or have been in existence for a very long time. So if you had a healer in your community, there was a very local aspect to it, trust that was built over time. Maybe that healer was part of a family of healers, and so if we actually look towards that and why it worked, in contemporary times, we can think of different countries that have like lady health workers or, who go around door to door and do education. And we talked about outreach too, Sean, like the face-to-face aspect of it is so radically different from this idea of telemedicine or, and so this personalized kind of idea of this care and medicine giving, I think, before we go on to supply chains and actual objects, I think looking back towards that and saying there are no innovations to be necessarily had. There's actually just slowing down a bit and understanding what worked and still works, and what's effective, and stop trying to like come from a solutionist mindset where we just need to find the next tech to make this happen, right? And so that being said, I think I'm placing an importance on being in proximity with the person who gives you medicine or teaches you about how to care for yourself. And in terms of supply chains, if we're talking about open insulin, the ideal is to have community level production. So we're talking about like, perhaps a bioreactor or a particular apparatus that would actually make the insulin, have that service like perhaps like in one a magnitude of 10,000 patients who would need insulin, and so you can actually see where it's being produced, who's producing it, and there are obviously, and I can go into sort of like the difficulties of the science and stuff, but in theory this is very, very important. And in practice, it will be very important to be able to do this in Oakland, California, and do this in Yaoundé, Cameroon, under very different circumstances and very different access to different materials in the supply chain, but producing the same high quality product for our community members.
Yeah, so this question brings me back to when I was collecting data in Nigeria about 3 years ago. So it's pretty difficult that state. So I'll give you some background information. So for the breast cancer that I study, actually breast cancer in general, if you're diagnosed with breast cancer, typically what happens in North America or developed countries is that they do a test. They would take a piece of like a surgical specimen from the breast, and they would test it for a few biomarkers. And you get back the test relatively quickly because it doesn't take that long to actually do the test. So let me say a week or so or less. And then your oncologist will then uh, tell the patient what their treatment options are based on the test for these biomarkers. Now, in Nigeria, at some of the hospitals I visited, the situation is a bit different, a lot different actually. So patients would have to pay for all of the components to actually even get the test done. So it's not free as it is in North America or in Barbados even. And then to actually get the test done, it has to be outsourced. So it has to be sent somewhere. And that process can take about 6 weeks for them to send the sample to some other place and get the results back. So as you can imagine, in North America, if it's less than a week, you can start treatment right away. So like basically by the next week, you can start treatment. But however, in Nigeria, they had to wait 6 weeks, but in all of that time, the tumor is just growing and growing and growing, and the physician doesn't know to treat the tumor because the test result isn't back yet. So that was really concerning to me. And some big pharma companies have tried to help the situation in that they would provide fridges and stuff for the antibodies so that they can do the test on site. But after a while, after a specific time, then they start to bill these hospitals, and it's not sustainable. And then it just loops all over again. And that is so broken to me. And yeah, if I had lots of money, actually, I would pump it towards there. That's going to be a question later on, I think. But yeah, it's a broken system right now. And as you said, we need to find ways to decentralize, but I don't have the solutions right now.
I mean, I wonder, Sean, could you imagine in the very near future, like DIY biology being a part of something that gets to be like institutionalized knowledge, like let's say, for example, in Nigeria. And so, DIY biology doesn't have to mean low quality biology, but I think to me, what it means is culturally appropriate and understanding resource constraints at a particular location. Do you see, and I'm thinking about a particular colleague who taught me how to do a pap smear on our own.
Wow.
And 3D printed a speculum. And so, and I mentioned women's bodies specifically too, because of, the historical power taking away from women's and their body. And then it becomes an intersectional issue altogether as well. If you are a minority, if you're Black or brown, you get treated a specific way by the healthcare system, right, and its actors. And so, if my colleague could devise something where, and I felt amazed that I could learn about the dyes that were used to color my cells, and they devised a camera where you can do actual colposcopies, which means that you're looking into a woman's cervix to do like a rapid screen for cervical cancer. Mm-hmm. And one application of this would be, let's say, if it was a migrant person who needed healthcare on the fly and was not in a position to get healthcare in a country that they recently emigrated to. I mean, there are things about safety for sure, but in terms of could we imagine this as our near future, giving, whether it's mutual aid and knowledge dissemination, and then kind of doing it as a practice on the institutional level.
Mhm.
I kind of see that happening with the breast cancer as well.
Yeah, so right now, actually, they have these things called, or this system where they would get, so pathologists across the world will sign on to this database and they would be able to examine the surgical specimen that you have, for instance, via an iPad or some kind of tablet, some kind of device, mobile device, and they would meet with either the healthcare team or the patient and talk about the pathology from whatever slide they have. So yeah, I think there are ways that we can integrate all these things together so that you really have the patient at mind and not like big pharma with the institution and the money in mind. Yeah.
So I'm going to go into the next question. It's the second last question. What we've kind of touched on this already, but what are you advocating for in your vision of healthcare? But we've already touched up on that a bit. But most importantly is who do we need to bring into these conversations to make these changes happen? So if you could like have a list of like 3 phone numbers and you could just like call them up and they would be like willing to say yes to anything, who would they be?
Patients should be number one, like, but there's no like one phone number for patients. But yeah, patients should be number one because we, the populace, right, who are accessing healthcare constantly or at some point in our lives, like that's the only way change is going to happen. If it's just a room full of like the hospital admin making decisions, it's not going to go anywhere. It'll just continue to be the same way that it is right now. Because it's so easy to be sitting in a room and making decisions when you're not being the one affected directly. And I think this scenario right now that we're in globally is kind of pushing that with a few people. They're like, it could be me or it could be right. So there are a lot of decisions being made right now out of that, I guess, necessity to survive. But that's not really. I don't personally feel that that is at the forefront of the minds of these executives in these boardrooms. So patients 100% should be um, at the table when we are thinking about these things and these changes. Yeah, that's a really big question.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
Well, I'm going to riff on Sean's answer because I had the same answer in terms of patients or the people affected the most. And then also when we think about equity or inequities towards care and stuff like that. And so ideally, in my head, the number one person, if I had to choose one out of all the patients, it would be someone who has actually taken up agency to advocate for themselves and a group of others, and who has a powerful narrative. This storytelling aspect, we probably hear it in so many different circles right now, to do the storytelling, to make something very, very tangible by putting a personal story behind it. But they have lived that experience in a way that I myself probably could not speak of. For instance, open insulin, I am not insulin dependent. I'm, my insulin is just fine. And so is my pancreas. And so, for me, putting those affected by insulin shortages and inaccess to insulin has to be the center of the work that we do. Second person I would call is, again, maybe I should just actually frame it with insulin because it's such a clear example of who we need at the table. Policymakers, or a policymaker who has made it their business and to fight for their constituency. It could be a state level person or a representative, congressperson who is actually fighting to change laws around pharmaceuticals, around price gouging, around price fixing, and understanding the dynamics of how it deeply affects their constituency when they can't get access to healthcare, right? So that would be number two. And number three, I mean, I kind of want to meet with like some of the pharmaceuticals that are making like a CEO. I want to pick their brain. I mean, I don't think I'm going to get any novel ideas, but I just want to be like, why? Why? You know?
Yeah.
And I want to interview them too. Maybe not much different from this kind of panel, and like just be like, it's so simple. Like, just release this information. And look elsewhere. And so those are the three. And you know, you can imagine if all three came to the table, what that would look like.
Yeah. I like that.
And so the last question is, finally, if you had unlimited funds and you could fund any body of research or any initiative, what would you support? This is like a lifetime. This goes beyond your life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about this question a lot, like at least once a week. I'm like, if I had lots of money, unlimited money, like what would I want to do? Where would I put it? Like research wise. So a lot of my time recently, so I would say even before pursuing my Master of Public Health, actually, I was always interested with inequities in health and social determinants of health. And because these have a large outcome on health, obviously, just as the case that I talked about in Nigeria, where this tumor is just growing as you wait weeks upon weeks to see these test results, or even you might not even have the money to even start with getting the test results. Let's start there. So yeah, I'm very interested and have always been for quite some time interested in closing these gaps or making whatever small dent I can to help close these health inequity gaps. And I would throw a bunch of money, as much money as I could, towards that, because it goes beyond skin color or anything. Like it's really deeply rooted in locations and governments and policies. There's so many layers to health inequities that I would love to tackle, but you know, I'm just trying my best in my little breast cancer circle right now. But if I could, I would definitely throw money at that. And obviously that's going to generate so much data. For my project right now, I have 10 terabytes of data, of just sequencing data. That is a lot of data for just one study, right? So I would also throw a lot of money into appropriately managing these data, big data, and having people that can analyze it around the clock. And I was only limited to a certain number of patients for my study because of money. Like it obviously would have a lot more power if I had a larger sample size, like things like that. Like if I had money, I would just do a larger sample. I would, yeah, I would do so much with that, and also maintaining proper management of the data, so that the data are um, the data belongs to the individual who contributed to those data. Um, and I don't think a lot of emphasis is placed on that. So I'd also throw a lot of money in that direction to ensure that the data are appropriately managed and not appropriately defined by me, but by the patient or the participants involved in the studies.
I'm
That's
sorry.
a very long, rambly answer. Sorry.
It's okay. Why is it important for patients to have ownership over that data?
Because they contributed to it. Like if I were to be entering a study, and I contributed my DNA, like that is literally my the blueprint of my life. Like all the cells in my body are obeying this blueprint that I just contributed to. So whatever you're doing with that, it needs to be mine, and you can't just go off and run and do whatever you want to do with my data. That's a whole other discussion in itself. But yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
It just reminded me of the high school kids that I mentioned when I was recruiting, and I was like, who knows 23andMe? And they'd be like, oh, you know, they take your DNA, and they knew so much. I would be like, do you want to give them your DNA? And they're like, no. And it was really cute. And so this kind of literacy around, you know, your body and your autonomy over your information, I think really needs to happen at an early age. And I guess I didn't really preface that or like set up the context of this particular high school. They are very under-resourced. Their biology teachers, and I'm not going to name names, but their biology teachers will come for like 2 weeks and then quit. It's not an easy school to teach at, but the kids are pretty amazing. And so that being said, it is like, to me, an extra layer of understanding like why it's important to not have someone exploit your physical, a physical specimen or a sample of you, especially if you have, again, historically been exploited, your bodies, your ancestors' bodies. And so I'm very mindful of what that looks like. And I'm so glad that Sean and I talked about this in the 5 minutes that we have for prep time. It's definitely really important. And I can see like new models emerging in terms of community ownership of data. And, you know, maybe it's in the form of co-ops. I think there is one existing co-op with patient-centered data that's based in New York City. But this is, I think, how we should start thinking about like, you know, value of bodies, value of things that come out of the bodies, who's profiting off of that. And that could be a whole nother discussion too, and I'd love to have that. So thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I guess when it comes to like, what would I throw my money at? A lot of things come to mind, but I'll try to just boil it down. Like, I would love to give the project Open Insulin like a huge infusion. To me, it's not a project of hubris or proving that we can do it. It's actually something of significant impact. It's a demonstration that if people can actually decentralize this knowledge and train each other, then it's entirely possible to heal each other instead of relying on government or relying on big institutions to take care of you. So it's allowing channels to reconnect the mode of healing to the individual, to a community. And so, you know, ostensibly, like, I look at the theory behind it and stuff, it's a lot more about solidarity, and it's a lot more about mutual aid than it is anything else. And so, yes, and it is a big FU to people who try to control our bodies. Yes, but that's sort of like a side thing, right? So I think about that. And so in doing so, I think like being able to have freely flowing information and supply chains would be so amazing, so that, you know, the thing that you need might be very easily accessible to make that community biolab in Senegal, you know, so that it can be made, or in Belgium, And so that's what I think about a lot. And then my last thing, because I have endless amounts of money, right, is giving more money towards community engagement and outreach in all fields. So whether that's city planning, whether that's science, when we talk about community resilience, I was just talking about this with somebody else prior to this panel. Resilience, I think, is oftentimes looked at sort of like climate resilience. But, you know, when we take a 360 view of resilience and we think about economic resilience, we think about valuing in place. These are very like, kind of like, I don't know, nebulous things that I don't think really, like, as a person who lives here right now, you know, that I think about daily, like, how do I forge these connections with my neighbors and make ourselves resilient in the face of pandemics, in the face of climate change, in the face of anything else that gets thrown in our way, right? And so I think community engagement strategies that actually serve the people, they don't get money. It's just a matter of fact, right? If you want to do this thing, a lot of times it's done by volunteers, right? And so I feel that since the value of their work has not been highlighted, or that, like, you know, or money doesn't get allotted to that, whether again in a municipality or a nonprofit situation, that money I would freely throw to create, like, you know, other nonprofits that I don't even know if I want them to be nonprofits or just like, you know, money networks, but being able to educate people in a way that's equitable, and so that it just strengthens whatever's there, is what I really want, and what I think we do need for like an actual resilient future. And so, and then really, I don't want that to be like a speculative thing. I want that to be reality.
Thanks so much. So we're now at the end of the panel. Unfortunately, Sharona Franklin couldn't join us today, but I'm so thankful that Sean Hercules and Ramy Kim were able to contribute their perspectives. It doesn't look like there are any more questions in the chat. Just some general comments about current state of healthcare, and someone whose family is in the healthcare industry, and they're like, yeah, I don't think there's any more questions, but thanks for joining us, and shout outs to Sugar Contemporary for supporting this panel, and paying speakers. I really love that when art follows through with that. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much, and bye.
Bye. Thanks for inviting me.